you very much, everybody, for coming to MDM 2.0 online as well as here in person. I'm going to introduce now your moderator for this session, which is Professor Foohey, who teaches at Cardozo School of Law. Her research centers on bankruptcy, commercial law, and consumer law. Introduce the rest of you.
Perfect. So first, I want to thank Pat McCoy, who is on the Zoom, for putting together this panel. The papers and the book projects go together really well. The panel focuses, I think, in many ways on where debt and credit sit within the United States social safety net. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So to kick it off, I'm going to really briefly introduce the panelists in the order of presentation. Each will come up here for about 15 minutes to present their work. Then I'll come back up here and provide about 15 minutes of commentary, and then we should have 10 to 15 minutes left for discussion. So first, Vijay Raghavan is an assistant professor of law at Brooklyn Law School. He'll be presenting an in-progress article titled Retheorizing Consumer Financial Reform. Then we'll turn it over to Chrystin Ondersma, who's a professor of law and the Judge Morris Stern Scholar at Rutgers Law. And she'll be presenting part of her book manuscript, which is forthcoming, Dismantling Debt. And then we'll turn over to Pat McCoy, who is the Liberty Mutual Insurance Professor of Law at Boston College Law. She'll also be presenting a portion of her book manuscript, and the title of the presentation is Spreading Risk to Attain a Living Income. And then Nakita Cuttino will close us out. She's an associate professor of law at Georgetown Law. She'll be presenting her in-progress article, Escaping Credit Purgatory. So with that, I'll turn it over to Vijay.
Okay, I want to thank Pat for letting me hop on. It was a late addition, and I begged Pat to let me join. She graciously did, and I want to thank Pamela for the introduction. I want to thank all of you for showing up and not going to session A. I love the people on this panel, though I'm not sure I would have made the same choice if I wasn't on it. So I have, this is my summer project. I will get it done this summer, but it's something I've been mulling over for a while. I have some sparse notes. I'll read them in a second. Just to foreground this piece, and maybe everyone on the panel, I think I started teaching in fall 2020. And when I was on the market, I really had a sense of who I was and the kind of work I was going to do. And then I read Abby Atkinson's Rethinking Credit as Social Provision, and it just wrecked me. It shattered my sense of self. I've been trying to figure out, for me, it really unsettled the normative case for consumer financial regulation. And so, across a few works, I've been trying to pick up the pieces and try to figure out why we do what we do. I think this is the last attempt I'm going to make at it. I feel like I've exhausted this space, at least for me. So anyways, that's this background. Okay, so what I'm trying to do in this paper is I'm trying to offer a new institutional account of consumer financial regulation, and to try to theorize it as a core component of our regulatory framework for money and banking. And I'm offering this reconceptualization to try to rehabilitate consumer financial regulation, to try to reconstruct the normative case for consumer financial regulation, and in some ways to push back against this really sharp and really powerful leftist critique of consumer financial regulation over the last decade, and which I think in some ways, although I'm convinced by a lot of it, in some ways I think it misses on some level what consumer financial regulation is doing. So over the last decade, legal scholars and sociologists have really mounted this sharp critique of our credit infrastructure and the regulation of credit markets. And this critique, across lots of works, I think makes sort of three key observations. The first is that credit has played a central role in American political economy in ways that has inhibited the development of a really robust welfare state in America. The second is that consumer advocates have often been instrumental in shaping America's credit economy by promoting private credit as social provision over direct social provision. And then the third is that the choice to pursue credit as social provision has had tremendous costs. And I think Abby's work is really key here to understanding the costs of our choice to attempt to use credit to fill in gaps in our safety net. And so for Abby, credit's a really imperfect form of social provision because it relies on a borrower to become independently wealthier between the time that credit is borrowed and it must be repaid. Credit that can't be repaid becomes debt, which has been a tool to subordinate socioeconomically marginalized groups. And so as a result, pursuing credit as our primary form of social provision has not only been misguided, but has likely really deepened inequality and possibly exacerbated the racial wealth gap. So I think the subtext of a lot of the subtext, and sometimes just the text of this post-crisis sociological and legal scholarship, is that consumer financial law has often worked to encase rather than unsettle existing hierarchies and the existing distribution of wealth. And in this sense, although consumer financial regulation engenders really fierce opposition from the right, it tends to embody these market-affirming values that are more consistent with traditions on the right rather than traditions on the left. So this is an attempt to try to rehabilitate consumer financial law from this critique and offer an alternative way to understand both the development of consumer financial law and the nature of consumer credit. Really to suggest that consumer financial law, although I'll continue. Okay, so to build this new account and try to push back against these critiques, I'm really drawing on another strand of post-crisis scholarship, and that's the recent literature on the legal and institutional design of money, which is like what informs much of this conference. And so, as many of you probably know, central themes of that scholarship are the legal design of money shapes exchange and matters for distribution, that our current institutional arrangement relies on financial institutions to expand the money supply by distributing public obligations in something that resembles a franchise relationship, and that the legal and institutional design of money have historically been sites of political contestation where we not only decided how our money would be distributed, but who would have control over this process and who would bear the costs. So in my view, I think a natural implication of those observations is that price and access in credit markets don't just reflect a private way to measure risk, but actually reflect the way we finance our institutional arrangement around money and banking. So you can kind of think of it as a regressive tax scheme. And understood as such, you can view consumer financial regulation as in part an attempt to redistribute those burdens, which in the absence of consumer financial regulation are borne disproportionately by those who have the least, and the benefits accrue to those who have the most. And as an attempt to try, in some measure, to reallocate who has power over the levers of monetary governance. So, recasting all of consumer financial regulation as a monetary phenomenon is necessarily reductive. Consumer financial law serves plural goals. But I think this reconceptualization really captures the way in which the development of consumer law has not just been top-down and expert-driven, but in many ways has been bottom-up. Driven by debtor movements agitating for change. And it's really been, for a lot of people who write about money as a democratic medium, the late 19th century is this rich era of political contestation, but the 20th century is this dead era. And I think one thing I'm trying to do in this piece is to sort of argue that money continued to be a site of political contestation. It's just not in obvious ways. And consumer financial reform isn't the exclusive site of those contests, but it's one site. It was a site, in my view, of contests over the legal design of money in the 20th century. And so the shape of those contests is not static. It's historically contingent. In the early 20th century, those contests were local in nature, and those were fights over local governance. In the middle of the 20th century, we federalized those contests and distributed some power over monetary governance across many agencies. And one way to understand the changes in 2010 is as a way to create to consolidate regulatory power over consumer financial regulation, not only to sort of better police consumer financial markets, but to give an institutional face to this agitation, to create an entity that actually perhaps could have the power to exert some control over monetary governance on behalf of a different constituents than the constituents normally represented by prudential regulators. Okay, so what's the point of all this? What do I hope to achieve? I think really two things, and this is I'm working this out. So I think that I think consumer financial law embodies both encasing and unsettling tendencies. I think it has tendencies. There's parts of consumer financial law that I think work to preserve existing hierarchies, and then there's parts of consumer financial law that work to unsettle those hierarchies. And I think trying to think about consumer financial reform as a site of political contestation over the legal design of money, and as a space where we try to redistribute burdens in credit markets, try to reallocate some power over monetary governance, can help us think through how we ought to design consumer financial reform, or what aspects we ought to preserve in order to ensure that it works to unsettle some of the regressivity of financial regulation, or of our institutional arrangements around money, as opposed to preserving that regressivity. What does that actually mean? I think on a fundamental level that may mean granting a consumer regulator some real control over the levers of monetary governance, including price setting and price control authority. Okay, so so that's one point. I mean, I think one way to understand a lot of consumer financial regulation is as downstream of our institutional arrangements around money and banking. It's really reactive, and it's trying to manage some of the regressivity that's built into those arrangements. And so many people are trying to reimagine what like a better financial system would look like. This conference is all about money as a democratic medium. But a lot of those conversations, it's not clear where the demos is, where the people are. And so I think, and to put this piece in conversation with the keynote speaker today, and to borrow from my colleague Jocelyn Simonson, it's not clear what the place of the people is in the people's ledger. And so I think one thing that I'm really trying to do is suggest that we can look to the development of consumer financial regulation over the course of the 20th century as we can mine some information about what kind of institutional arrangements we might want in order to not just make our financial system fairer, but to make it more representative. And I think that a more representative system includes a diversity of institutions representing different constituents. So.
Thank you, Vijay. Now you, Chrystin.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for being here. And Vijay, that was really cool. I am really excited about all of these papers. And I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you. I'm just going to give first a 4-sentence summary of my project and then flesh it out a little. So first, America's household debt policies are unjust and rooted in myths. I offer a new reality-based taxonomy of household debt and a new guiding principle for household debt policymaking: human dignity. This taxonomy consists of the intersecting and overlapping categories of survival debt, opportunity debt, and extractive debt. And I argue that the principle of human dignity requires an abolitionist approach to both survival and extractive debt and a reparative approach to opportunity debt. So first, our household debt policies are rooted in myths. Some of you may be familiar with the reality of household debt in America. We know that many households rely on debt to survive, and that when households turn to debt for opportunities like an education or a new home, these opportunities often don't materialize, particularly for Black and other marginalized households. But our current household debt policies are instead rooted in these myths. The myth of the strategic or abusive bankruptcy filer, the myth that borrowing leads to equality and prosperity, and all of these are connected to the overarching myth of a rational actor making choices in a free market. What's more, these myths are baked into our very basic household debt terminology. As Professor Abby Atkinson has shown, even the terms credit and debt serve to perpetuate these myths. In her article, Borrowing Equality, she unveils how policymakers outsource their equality goals to creditors and then use what she calls the acoustic separation of credit and debt, treating credit as a social good and debt as a failure to obscure the reality that credit can never be a solution to precarity or inequality. Or take the category of consumer debt in bankruptcy. This should be just a basic definition, but instead, ever since the passage of the Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act, it has basically devolved into a category for punishment. And the court cases that justify the constitutionality of treating consumer debtors worse than non-consumer debtors use language such as the classic case of the consumer debtor binging on luxury goods with no intention to repay. The very category of consumer debtor suggests abuse. So courts themselves have sort of accepted Congress's view that consumers who take on debt are just abusing the system. In 2005, they made it much more difficult for people to file in bankruptcy. Those of you that aren't bankruptcy experts made a bunch of hurdles for people whose debt qualifies as consumer debt in order to access relief, and they did it, justifying on the case that, well, these people that take on debt are just doing it strategically. So our debt policies, in addition, in terms of this myth stuff, our debt policies ignore the reality that households turn to debt just to survive, and they ignore the historic and ongoing inequality, discrimination, exclusion, extraction, and dispossession. They ignore that debt often is offered on predatory terms, and that especially for Black and other marginalized households. And they ignore the fact that in the past, the government did extend direct resources to households, just disproportionately white ones, and of course extended a bunch of resources to our financial institutions and big corporations. And if you go back to the Homestead Act, right, the government gave away more than 270 million acres, equaling 10% of total US land, to settlers, almost all of whom were white. These individuals and families could then pass down that land along with any wealth they earned from it to their children, who could pass it on to their children. So today, about 46 million property owners in the US are descendants of the original Homestead Act beneficiaries. And this is important because the wealth gap also relates to who needs to take on credit in order to meet their basic needs and in order to get a basic education. So also, our policies ignore pretty much the fact that home ownership opportunities such as the FHA, which is how many white households got a foothold in the middle class, were not extended to Black households and communities. Many other people have written about this, Heather McGee, and some of us, of course, Richard Rothstein. There's so many, but so our credit policies ignore all of this. Many households, as we said, then have to take on debt, and then they're punished for taking on debt, based on the myth that they abuse the system. So these myths work together to prevent many households from really having a decent quality of life. So I wanted to offer a reality-based taxonomy that could ultimately help policymakers discern between what type of debt might be potentially beneficial and what type of debt would be harmful. The first category, survival debt, I define as survival debt as debt that households incur to survive and achieve a standard of living consistent with human dignity. Examples of survival debt include medical debt, a payday loan incurred to avoid having your utilities shut off, groceries put on the credit card when income falls short, and debt incurred to acquire an education sufficient to earn a living wage. I define opportunity debt as debt that households incur to expand resources or opportunities. It can include includes debt to acquire an asset or a resource, such as a home, car, a washing machine, television set, or debt incurred to acquire a non-tangible opportunity like an education or a new experience like a vacation or a wedding or my new motorcycle. So that all counts as opportunity debt. Some debt would be both survival and extractive debt. So if you are incurring debt to access resources and opportunities, but also those resources and opportunities are necessary to achieve a minimal standard of living consistent with human dignity, then that would also be survival debt. So then anything that, like my new motorcycle that I did not need to survive, but was for fun, it was not survival debt, but was opportunity debt. But you can have debt that is both like a basic college education, many people would argue would also be survival and opportunity debt because you may not be able to get a job that pays a living wage without one. So my undergrad degree, I worked at a dry cleaners making minimum wage, probably not sufficient, right, to really, so then I got my college degree, then I could earn a living wage. I worked as a rape crisis counselor, made enough to make ends meet, and then I went to law school, right, so that then was opportunity debt. All right. Extractive debt. I define extractive debt as debt that primarily benefits someone other than the borrower and is substantially likely to harm the borrower. Extractive debt includes predatory high-cost loans, including payday loans or subprime credit cards or mortgages, as well as high-cost private student loans. So my taxonomy really has two dimensions: the reasons that people incur the debt, whether for survival or opportunity, can be sometimes both, or the nature of that debt, extractive or not extractive. All right, so how can this taxonomy help policymakers? Well, I say first we should jettison all the myths that we have, including the myth of a strategic actor working in a free market, because there is no such thing. I talk about all the government interventions, and that's not possible to have a free market when it comes to credit and banking anyways. So we have to talk about what type of regulations. But I suggest instead of free market efficiency, we should have a new guiding principle. And I choose human dignity. I think that ultimately it's the most universally understood, right? Economic efficiency is a term that's sort of used globally, and we already have a whole human rights thing going on around the world that although we may disagree on the content of it, there is content that is more or less shared and understood. Same with the idea of human dignity. I have a whole chapter where I go into different philosophers and other people that have advocated for human dignity, but I just want to highlight my favorite person to advocate the idea of human dignity as relates to a standard of living, and it is Colombia's new vice president. Her name is Francia Marquez. She's the first female and first Afro-Caribbean vice president, and she popularized this phrase, vivir sabroso, on the campaign trail. And vivir sabroso is a phrase that comes from her home region of Chocó. Literally, it translates to live deliciously, but she describes it as meaning to live richly and with dignity. So she says, vivir sabroso means to live with dignity, to live in peace, to live with guaranteed rights, to live without fear, and to live with joy. So for example, when she was asked whether moving into the vice presidential home would mean she could now vivir sabroso, she said, well, I already have a dignified home, but racism, classism, and threats of violence impede my ability to vivir sabroso. And so she said, if people could live on their land and fish and be free from threats of violence and not have their land taken away, they could still vivir sabroso. So it's not just about money, but the standard of living that you can achieve. So with inspiration from that phrase, I like to think of a standard of living consistent with human dignity as one in which individuals can meet their needs and live life without degradation and fear. I also, of course, talk about Kant's conception of dignity, which is a worth above all price, held insofar as the thing in question is not a means to further an end, but rather an end in itself. So that categorical imperative plays a role. And so I basically go through a bunch of other philosophers, and I come up with 3 core tenets that I think are applicable to household debt policymaking. The first, I say, the first core tenet that human dignity suggests is that individuals should be able to meet their needs and live life without degradation and fear. And that suggests that because I talk about all the problems with debt and the abuses of our debt and debt collection, that often to become indebted to survive means living with degradation and fear. That you have to take on debt in order to survive means you're also living with degradation and fear. The second core tenet of this human dignity framework is that no human should be indebted solely as a means for another's end. And then the third tenet that I suggest is the tenet of true equality, and I suggest that we should actively redistribute power, resources, and opportunities in order to achieve equal human dignity, and that people should have an equal enjoyment of the realization of their basic rights without discriminatory outcomes. And then I argue in the book that these core tenets require an abolitionist approach to both survival and extractive debt, and a reparative approach to opportunity debt. What does this look like? What do I mean by an abolitionist approach to survival and extractive debt? I draw from prison abolitionists, Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and I also look at grassroots prison abolitionist movements such as critical resistance. So, just as Angela Davis argued that prisons are unnecessary, ineffective, and inhumane, I argue that survival debt and extractive debt are unnecessary, ineffective, and inhumane. The other concept that I take from prison abolitionism is this concept of non-reformist reform. As abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore explained, criminal justice reform should unravel rather than widen the net of social control through criminalization. And so in the household debt context, I say that a reform should unravel rather than widen the net of unjust and inequitable household debt, a net, in fact, deeply interwoven with the carceral state, as Jackie Wang brilliantly shows in her book, Carceral Capitalism. So drawing from these strategies and from critical resistance, they have a bunch of questions that they ask when looking at certain policies to find out whether or not they would qualify as abolitionists. So I suggest the following questions in evaluating whether a policy may be consistent with an abolitionist approach to survival and extractive debt. Does this policy reduce the reliance on debt as a means for survival? Does this policy challenge the notion that debt is a solution to poverty and inequality? And does this policy reduce the scale of credit-based dispossession? So what would an abolitionist approach to survival debt look like? This is really so simple and obvious and so frustrating how far from achievable it often feels. But really an abolitionist approach to survival debt requires our government to ensure access to basic needs, affordable housing, transportation, medical care, and basic education without people having to take on so much debt in order to have these basic things. Many people in the world do this for their citizens through a system of robust taxation and redistribution. I talked to my friends I just got back from Norway, and my Norwegian friends, even the right-wing ones, just don't understand. Like, they don't argue about this type of stuff there, even though they have like conservative views on immigration, and they have transphobic people like everywhere around the world. But like, when it comes to how society should work in terms of providing needs for its citizens, it's like, obviously, we're going to make sure that people have basic medical care, basic education, and of course we pay taxes so that we can have these things. One of my friends said that she had a friend who became homeless and drug addicted, and the government put her in a home, gave her a house, gave her an education to become a nurse, gave her treatment, and now she's doing well. Like, they don't just let people just fall out of society and accept that some people are just excluded from participation and human dignity. So we do this with a fair system of taxation. I've written this book, I felt so frustrated so often, like, is this even possible in the US ever? But then the state of Minnesota came to the rescue by passing with just a 1-vote majority, all these sweeping reforms. Free school meals to children, free tuition at public colleges for families earning up to $80,000 a year, up to 18 weeks of paid family and medical leave, expanded health insurance access, a child tax credit of $1,750 per child for households making up to $35,000 a year, and then gradually phasing out around $96,000. And how did they afford this? Primarily by raising taxes just 1% on earnings over $600,000 for an individual and over $1 million for a married couple, and by closing some corporate tax loopholes. All right. Okay, what about an abolitionist approach to extractive debt? honestly, the best way to abolish extractive debt is still to focus on abolishing survival debt, which is still providing people with their basic needs, because as long as people need to turn to debt to survive, there's going to be a market for extractive debt. It's just too profitable for lenders to quit pursuing, and regulators will constantly be playing catch up. When some states pay payday loans, lenders just switch to small dollar installment loans that still hurt borrowers. So we still have to watch out for reformist measures that aren't abolitionist. Providing borrowers with additional information and disclosures probably won't help. Many borrowers are so desperate for funds that they have no choice but to accept predatory terms. I often cite this Pew study that shows that 37% of payday loan borrowers, when you ask them what term they would have accepted, they say they would have accepted the loan on any terms offered because they felt they had no choice but to take that money in that moment because of the emergency that arose. So there's a risk that if we prioritize the regulation of extractive debt over working on abolition of survival debt, that it gives the illusion that debt is safe, and that turning to debt to survival needs is an acceptable way for society to function as long as the terms of those loans are not predatory. And this is very much inspired also by Abby Atkinson's work, Rethinking Credit as Social Provision, where, unless the person becomes wealthy, they're not going wealthier, at least they're not going to be able to repay their debt, so they're not going to be better off. All right, so I do say that there are some harm reduction strategies, right? Because obviously survival debt and extractive debt are not going to disappear overnight. So what are some harm reduction strategies that are consistent with an abolitionist approach? There are anything basically that can reduce the market, right, for extractive debt. So I think like quick and easy and speedy debt relief, to the extent that we can do that, without diverting political capital from then these, providing basic needs measures that I think are the most important, would be great. We can also do things that make it more difficult for creditors to collect. Right now, our state courts are being used as collection mills, and state courts themselves can do some things to make it to create hurdles for creditors and debt collectors using them as tools for debt collection. Okay, now real quickly. There's also in my book talk about a bunch of really cool grassroots strategies that are neat and abolitionists, such as the debt collective and Kofi, these parents in Chicago that did a lot of cool work. But just real fast, opportunity debt. I say that we need a reparative approach to opportunity debt because of the historical discrimination, the extraction of wealth from Black households and communities. These resulted from both private discrimination and official government policies. So unless the government is willing to deploy funds to redress these disparities, we can never have truly equal human dignity. I believe that people without inherited wealth should be able to get grants to go to school or to start a business or to get a home, rather than having to turn to debt for these things. So I think that there's no way around it, that without reparations, we will not have equal human dignity in the United States. I think like one example of a bill that is consistent with a reparative approach is Elizabeth Warren's proposed bill, the American Housing and Economic Mobility Act, because she suggested providing grants for down payments on homes, not just loan, but grants in historically redlined areas. So at the end of my book, I just discussed some barriers to reform, hoarding, racism. I consider whether capitalism itself is a barrier, although I say we've never tried capitalism where taxpayers are insisting on human dignity as a fundamental principle, right? So we can allow corporations to pursue profit, but we, the taxpayer, can make our policymakers tell corporations what they can do, what they cannot do, and what they must do. The biggest thing I think is fixing our tax system so that the wealthy individuals and corporations contribute their fair share, so that maybe one day everyone can vivir sabroso. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. You may hear my dog Max in the background, and I may get up and close the door if it gets too noisy. So I'm going to share screen. Talk today comes from a book I'm working on, which is called "And Economic Well-Being for All." In the book, I asked the question, what would it really take in the United States for every person to enjoy a sense of economic security, what I call economic well-being? And the book proceeds from the observation that over the past half century, the United States has moved to a system where we formerly collectively bore financial risks and spread them across institutions, be they government or businesses, and businesses and government have offloaded those financial risks in the past half century onto households' shoulders. That was the key observation of Jacob Hacker. And then I think it's fair to say that this entire panel has been inspired by Abby Atkinson's crucial work. I too was stopped in my tracks when I first read her article on predator social provision. She established how today society and government increasingly expects households to manage their financial risks by incurring consumer debt. And we certainly are aware of that in the payday lending area with student loans. The chapter I'm working on right now is about healthcare, and I'm struck at how many tens of millions of households have no way to pay for their medical bills without incurring large medical debt. The real inspiration for this book came from my realization that today, half of US households make less than a living income. I think that's absolutely shocking, and it's unacceptable in the world's largest industrial economy. We have reached a tipping point in the United States. This state of affairs is financially unsustainable for the half of households involved. But as I think we all know, it has become politically destabilizing. My thesis in the book and in this talk is really the flip side of Chrystin's talk, which is that medium and lower income households should not be expected to rely on debt to achieve their major financial goals. And the one exception that I would make is for home ownership, but that comes with many, many guardrails that would surround that debt financing. Instead, I maintain that the US needs to revive a whole host of mechanisms that spread financial risks across the government, across taxpayers, across businesses. There are some that are private in nature. They don't all have to be governmental. But all of these risk-spreading mechanisms serve to relieve the financial burdens on households. We did it before. We can do it again. The way I operationalize the idea of economic well-being is to break it into 5 goals that many households may have all 5. The first one is the subject of today's talk, which is making ends meet. It's simply getting through the month and paying basic expenses. The second, for households who want it, is home ownership. The third is for paying for medical care. The fourth, again, for households who want it, is to be able to send their children to college. And then finally, a secure retirement. So today's talk focuses on that first goal, which is simply paying for subsistence cost. Today's talk in this chapter is focused on working households. I have a separate household on a separate chapter on households that do not work. But today, working households make up over 3/4 of US families. In another chapter, I survey the state of the US labor market, and my conclusion is that we are in a place today where the US economy has failed to produce enough jobs and enough hours of work at adequate pay to enable the average working family to support itself. From this observation, I derive 4 principles. First of all, solutions that are modeled on traditional anti-poverty policies that are very harsh and punitive simply do not work when you're talking about half the populace. We cannot go down that road anymore. Secondly, to enable families to make ends meet, to pay for their basic expenses, we have to address 2 goals. One is when they're working, they need to receive adequate baseline pay. And secondly, when they're hit with negative income shocks, we need to have a solution that tides them over until they return to the workforce. On the first goal, adequate baseline pay, I propose pairing a substantially higher federal minimum wage with an expanded earned income tax credit and also a child tax credit. Parenthetically, I think everybody probably knows that there's this very robust and interesting debate about whether we should adopt a universal basic income. In effect, our earned income tax credit and child tax credit are very close to approximating that, but without the rhetorical baggage that we get with UBI. And then finally, for negative income shocks, the number one need is a dramatic expansion of unemployment insurance. And so the rest of today's talk, I'm going to focus on unemployment. In the past 50 or 60 years, we have seen increased income volatility, and I'm sorry to say that it's in the negative direction. Over the past few decades, an increasing percentage of households have suffered sharp drops in income. And we can trace where that money has gone. Capital is claiming an increased share of productivity at the expense of workers. A very interesting economist named Gouvenin has documented this, and what he found is that since at least 1980, what he calls disaster shocks, large downward movements in earnings have outnumbered large increases in earnings. So the income volatility has been getting worse over time, and the size of the income declines have been getting worse. As a result, if you just look at people across the board in the United States, they face a large chance of undergoing some sort of involuntary income loss during their working years. The 2 biggest causes for these types of negative income shocks are unemployment and erratic work hours. Now, in the United States, unemployment insurance is the main supposed solution, the main source of replacement income when people lose their jobs. We can divide unemployment insurance into 2 parts. The basic program is what I'm going to talk about today, which is the ordinary unemployment insurance system in which states pay for the benefits and the funding comes from taxes paid by employers in a particular state. I'll just add that there is a federal program that's called expanded or extended UI that kicks in during recessions, but it otherwise is not available. When I looked at the coverage of basic unemployment insurance in 2019 in the US, I was really shocked to find that almost 3/4 of workers who lost their jobs that year were ineligible for unemployment benefits. And the basic reason is that unemployment insurance is riddled with coverage exclusions that have mushroomed over time and that disqualify the vast majority of people who otherwise need and want basic UI. Parenthetically, I'll just add that even for people who got it, unemployment insurance benefits are pitifully low, nowhere near covering basic living expenses. So how did we get to this point? By the way, you would think by now I would know how to show my slides. Congress created unemployment insurance in 1935, but it adopted a very narrow philosophy of who should get unemployment insurance. The philosophy was that it would only go to unionized manufacturing workers who were better paid to begin with. They were full-time, and if they were laid off, generally their companies took them back once sales picked up, so that their layoffs were temporary. Congress also assumed that jobless workers had union stipends that would also help tide them over a spell of joblessness. And so when Congress designed unemployment insurance, it set the eligibility requirements to exclude a large number of workers. First of all, those who are lower paid and often part-time. Now, I want to note that this is gendered. Congress assumed that the workers it was protecting were male. And to the extent that women worked, they often were lower paid, they often were part-time, so they were excluded. Secondly, it excluded independent contractors and the self-employed. And then finally, it excluded those who were not called back to the job, those who suffered long-term unemployment. Another pernicious aspect of the 1935 legislation was that to win passage, Congress had to appease certain members of Congress who were white supremacists. And to facilitate racial exclusion, Congress delegated the authority to the states to set eligibility standards and benefits levels. In subsequent years, pretty much every time we've had a recession, states have progressively cut back on UI eligibility, benefits, and duration. And the reason they've done that is to attract employers to relocate to their states. Well, suffice it to say that labor market conditions have changed quite a bit since 1935. From 1979 to the present, manufacturing jobs have fallen 1/3. Unionization positions have fallen 2/3, and most of those are public sector. Unionization has collapsed in the private sector. What replaced these positions were service sector jobs that have lower hourly pay and offer fewer hours. And to get a sense of how lethal it is when you combine a lower hourly wage with less than 40 hours a week, that's the situation for the average worker in the leisure and hospitality industry. And for the years that I've noted on my slides, workers in that industry only earned 38% the weekly pay of average manufacturing workers. So what this reflects is not only low wages, but an increase in part-time schedules with erratic hours and pay. The sort of hours where let's say McDonald's, and this happened to my nephew, McDonald's will say, we can only give you 18 hours this week, and it will be a different day and different hours than it was last week. So you can't really moonlight. You always have to be on reserve for the shifting schedule. And then we finally see them move to gig jobs. Over the past 40 years or so, permanent layoffs have replaced temporary layoffs. And what that means is that the length of the average stint of joblessness has gotten longer. Today, the risk of job loss is so extreme that by the time an American reaches the age of 60, 2/3 of them will have experienced unemployment. So unemployment is a basic reality for most US workers. As I alluded to before, unemployment insurance's coverage has not kept up with these changing labor market conditions. Basic unemployment insurance has a number of eligibility standards, and if you flunk any one of them, you can be and will be denied coverage. One of those standards is what's known as the traditional monetary test, and I won't bore you with the details, but basically, the state will look back over the last 5 quarters of the applicant's work history and ask, did you earn enough money? And if you didn't earn enough money, you don't get unemployment insurance. So it's the lowest paid workers that get kicked out under that one, and part-time workers as well. A second eligibility standard is that in most states, applicants have to have been involuntarily terminated. What that means is that it excludes workers who were forced to resign to care for children or elderly relatives, and workers who were forced to leave because their employers cut their pay or their hours, or gave them unpredictable job schedules that were just wholly inconsistent with their other life responsibilities. And then finally, to qualify for basic UI, you must have worked for a third-party employer. So if you're a gig worker who has been misclassified as an independent contractor, you're excluded, as are other so-called independent contractors, as are the self-employed. This is my last slide. So let me just conclude by putting on the table what I think are needed reforms to basic unemployment insurance. First, we need to wrest control over basic UI away from the states and give the federal government sole authority to set eligibility standards, to set how long benefits will last and benefits levels. The states have a fundamental conflict of interest. They are supposed to pay adequate UI benefits, but what they really want to do is attract more private employment to their states. And so we've seen again and again and again that they slash UI benefits in order to attract private employers. Secondly, I would scrap that traditional monetary test where you have to make a certain amount of money with a very generous hours test that looks at the number of hours that the person has worked. And the test that is on the table is one that most part-time workers could readily meet. Third, I would expand basic UI to cover workers who quit their jobs due to major adverse changes in their hours or work schedules that are beyond their controls. This is the direction that the labor market has moved toward, and is entirely unfair to penalize those workers by denying them UI. Fourth, expand UI benefits to workers who resign for compelling family reasons. Now, what's interesting is in 2009, Congress passed a law that provided states with financial incentives to expand UI this way, and 21 states have done it. So I'm not smoking the wrong stuff. About 40% of the states already do this. Same thing for adopting a presumption that workers are employees and narrowing the independent contractor exclusion. Again, 21 states in response to these federal financial incentives have done so. And then lastly, I would increase the basic UI benefits and duration. So with that, thank you so much, and I look forward to any questions or comments.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you. All right, I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me on this panel, despite my many attempts to figure out a way out and say I wasn't ready for it. So I look forward to your thoughts on my very, very early stage idea. So my paper is about credit scoring. It actually builds on Pamela's work, so I'm really excited to hear your thoughts about the frictions of our credit scoring system. And it focuses on the impact of the FICO score in particular, since that's the most commonly used credit score in the marketplace, and particularly used by another big three, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. And so as you know, it's a 3-digit number based on an algorithmic assessment of one's credit worthiness. And it dictates much of our daily financial lives. And for 42% of the US population, that's 106 million people, that number can inhibit their ability to earn income, to save money, and to ultimately grow wealth. So that number breaks down into really 3 categories of consumers. There are 50 million who are credit invisible or unscorable. These individuals have no or very little or very old credit history, and therefore they cannot generate a credit score. And the remaining 56 million are credit impaired, as I call them in the paper, because they have poor or credit score below 670. And that signals to those who rely on it that they are high in credit risk. And so as a result of being credit invisible, unscorable, or credit poor or fair, these consumers have severely limited access to low-cost mainstream credit products. They pay higher rates for car insurance, 76% premium to be exact. That's about $1,100 more annually because of their credit scores. They pay more for utilities. There's an anecdotal article about an individual who almost lost out on a homelessness because she couldn't pay a $440 security deposit to have her utilities turned on. And that security deposit was sort of invoked because of her credit score. And the only reason why she was saved was because there was a nonprofit who stepped in to help her pay the security deposit. And so it impacts her utility somehow. Also, it can bar access to desirable housing. Most recently, there was the first Gen Z congressman from Florida talked about how he wasn't able to get housing in DC, despite having a 6-figure job, despite having a letter saying he was in Congress because of his credit score. And then also individuals miss out on employment opportunities. 1/3 of hiring managers report in a small survey that they run credit checks for candidates. And then again, there are some anecdotal news articles about how different employers, especially financial employers, like a Fidelity article that I read about, where they've gone through the sort of employment screening, they've received an offer, so everything suggests that they qualify, but they decide to do a credit check and then they revoke the offer. And then lastly, and part of the thing I tease out in the paper is that these individuals are often relegated to the fringe credit market. That's the payday loans, the pawn shops, the rent to own, those services that can further deplete their financial resources and cause a perpetual cycle of debt and increase costs in many ways that many of us have already explored in here before. And so in the draft, I say that if cash is king, then a credit score is kingmaker. One actually needs a credit score. It's a gatekeeper that enables wealth creation, or it can exacerbate or entrench financial fragility. And since employment, utilities, cars, loans that we all know are actually essential to just maintaining our livelihoods, are essential for, all these things are essential for daily living, a credit score is actually more than just about wealth. It's actually just about livelihood. One needs it to just exist. And so that's why what I call the conundrum of credit scoring is hugely problematic. And that's the fact that one needs to have credit history or activity, trade lines in order to build a credit score. But one needs to have a credit score in order to have access to these credit products in order to build that score, and on and on and on. It seems kind of ridiculous. And so how do some consumers overcome this conundrum? Financial privilege. Many young adults who find their way out of credit invisibility do so through student loans and or guaranteed debt by relatives. And so this is just to show that in comparison, actually students who, or not students, young adults from low income, minority, or immigrant backgrounds do not have the same ability to sort of get into the credit scoring game. Now, there are many efforts to resolve this credit score conundrum, and they tend to fall into two categories. One is expanding traditional credit scoring models for broader access to mainstream credit, and the other is just completely evading it like the fringe market already does, and just improving the fringe credit market in and of itself so that one doesn't need to rely on a credit score in order to get access to get credit products. And so these are two silos that I'm talking about. There are silo sort of efforts being pushed in ways that I think creates the credit purgatory that I'm hinting to. And that's because expanded models include marketplace lending, peer-to-peer lending, like fintech solutions that look at big data and alternative data points like social media, rent, utilities, educational background. They're like, okay, let's expand the pool of information so that we can bring in some credit impaired, invisible, unscorable individuals. But recent sort of studies suggest that actually those earlier championed marketplace lending solutions, they've done less to expand access for those who don't have access and done more to create more solutions or options for those who already had access. And so that arguably is not succeeding. And then there's also evidence that with the breadth of data that they use, there are sophisticated computations and modeling, and the fact that many providers will say that I'm not sure why the output is a rejection because it's a black box, then that can create or run the risk of the bias that we try to take out of underwriting and credit scoring. And what I found interesting, because it was my alma mater, there was a consumer protection group ran a sort of study and showed that would-be borrowers who graduated from Howard University, a historically Black college, faced higher fees than those students who did not graduate from an HBCU, despite having identical financial profiles that they created for them. And that couldn't be explained by the provider. And of course, it wasn't intended, but that was just an outcome of this algorithm that was championed as being more expensive. And then you have the big three that have themselves expanded their credit models to include assessments of rent and utility payments, as well as buy now, pay later payments, which are like fintech solutions that are similar to I guess rent to own, it's a solution that I'll talk about in the fringe credit innovation space. But those originally were not reported to credit bureaus, and so the Big Three decided that one can report those for credit. The downsides of this expansion, though, is that landlords, utility providers, buy now, pay later providers have no incentive or desire really to report, and so there is sort of little uptake on that invitation, which leads to the last innovation that I've sort of highlighted in the mainstream space, and that's these third parties that are reporting on behalf of consumers. And so particularly when it comes to rent payments, there are a number of providers that offer services to report rent payments to the credit bureaus, and they could be paid by the landlord or they could be paid by the consumer themselves. And so I critique, especially the ones paid by the consumers, that if we're trying to expand access for those who are already financially fragile and create a more equitable sort of credit scoring system, it does not make sense to have them be the only ones paying to find ways to build their credit scores. And the most problematic of this, so these various ways to improve the mainstream or expand credit scoring, is that it perpetuates a look back requirement for building credit that I think creates the same conundrum for at least some individuals. To rely on rent and utility payments suggests that individuals will have rent and utility history. And with an increasing number of individuals staying home, renting rooms from friends, they may not have rent or utility payments in their names. And since rent and utilities the cost of those can go up based on not having a credit score, you create the same sort of circle. Like you don't take them out because they're too expensive and now you aren't able to build. And so that seemed unsatisfying. And then looking to the fringe market where they continue to evade credit scoring. And that's earned wage access programs that I highlight that I talked about in an earlier project. They're alternatives to payday loans, where they sort of claim to eradicate the need for payday lending by allowing sort of one-time or occasional payments or early payments on wages for no or low fees. And I show or suggest that they run similar risks to payday lending, including snowballing costs if people repeatedly use them. And again, buy now, pay later. These products were originally suggested as not being loans or credit. I think most acknowledge that they are at this point, but they allow sort of installment payments for products. And it can lead again to a sort of overuse and heightened cost that can prove detrimental for individuals. And then the last thing in the fringe credit market space is, I think, an ongoing thing for decades, is just regulation that just keeps missing the mark, or at least keeps getting outsmarted by the marketplace. When you have regulators that try to rein in the fringe marketplace or restrict or ban it, they, like Chrystin has said, they create sort of alter their terms or find ways to morph in order to sort of sustain the market. And so these innovations do little to curb the risk. And more importantly, even if one overcomes the risk, they do little to bridge the gap between the fringe market and the mainstream market. One cannot use these products and build credit in order to eventually get to the low cost or ideal credit products. And so that's the conundrum, or that's the credit purgatory that I'm trying to resolve, like how these two siloed solutions or siloed sort of ways of trying to resolve this problem actually do not bridge the gap to create a level playing field for all individuals to build credit. And so it led me to the ultimate question of why do we have to build credit in the first place? And why is it that we aren't, like, what is credit worthiness? And why does one have to build it? And why aren't we presumed credit worthy at the outside? Why can't one lose credit worthiness as opposed to it? And then it had me thinking about something way out of my area, the presumption of innocence. and trying to draw parallels and like whatever the underlying sort of norms of that is. There's some value to presuming the best in people in order to ensure fair outcomes. And if credit is so essential to life and a way that freedom is, then I would think that the presumption of creditworthiness should be a starting point. And so that is what I'm trying to tease out in this project. And then again, building on or making the point that a credit score is essential in order to say that creditworthiness or presumption thereof is also necessary. And so I'll stop there.
Great, so if all the panelists could join at the front here for questions. We have a few in the chat.
Oh, we have ones in the chat. So I was potentially tasked with giving some comments, and so maybe I'll take a little bit of a prerogative and try to whittle down what would be my comments to like 5 to 8 minutes, and then leave 10 minutes for some questions. So, thank you all for really fantastic and thought-provoking presentations and papers. I probably am the only person in this room apparently who uses paper, and so I printed comments and then I wrote all over them. And if I just want to give some overarching thoughts here, because everything goes together so well, which is really a testament to Pat's ability to put together a panel. And all of the papers and the book excerpts, I think, are addressing a big issue that's been percolating for decades in the United States, which is the retraction of support and provisions by the federal government and state governments for individuals and families, and then also just the unwillingness of the federal government or the government to do anything for people and address systemic harms that have been building over hundreds of years. And so this results in people needing to find a way to deal with emergencies and just to fund their daily lives. And then people turn to credit in a variety of forms. And this credit creates precarity. And I wanted to say the word precarity because it came up in a bunch, or at least a couple of the papers. And it's a term used in sociology, anthropology, and philosophy to characterize how some populations can't live stable lives because of social or ailing social and economic networks. And I think in the United States, those populations just keep expanding. And the word precarity often is used along with the idea of privatization of risk, which has come up repeatedly, and sometimes with the word vulnerability. And I also think, and I wanted to give another nod to Abby Atkinson, that there's been a renewed focus on describing debt and credit and disaggregating them, but then bringing them back together, which I think has been really useful because that brings out the risky nature of entering into credit relationships, which is incurring debt, especially in the context of systemic inequalities that have existed forever. And households, of course, aren't good risk spreaders. And the last thing I'll say is that in terms of what I've been doing, the timing of this panel is perfect. And I've been thinking a lot recently about people who file bankruptcy and what their cases show about the state of precarity in the United States and also just life precarity in the United States. And my co-authors and I on the Consumer Bankruptcy Project are writing a book about how people now live in a constant state of economic insecurity through the lens of people filing bankruptcy. It's going to be published by University of California Press, and I would be remiss not to mention that both Chrystin's and Pat's book also being published by University of California Press, and also we three of us have the same editor. So look for like biggest hits in money law stuff coming soon in the next like couple years from University of California Press. And so I'm just going to quickly turn to each paper and offer some comments kind of in turn. So Vijay, I think you offer like a really novel way to think about the incentives behind consumer financial regulation and how that regulation interacts with the financial institutions and where that fits with the money supply, which is new. Like it has not been brought out before, and I think this will be used often. What I really liked about it is that you bring in the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau explicitly, but broadly, and not just talking about one thing the CFPB is doing. And when I think of the creation of the CFPB, sometimes I think that there's almost was an implicit recognition that we've kind of acquiesced to the place of credit in people's lives, and that the people looking at the CFPB sometimes see it that way, which might not have been and probably was not an acquiescence that was in mind when the CFPB was created. So I think it'd be really useful to talk about that more in the book. And also kind of to bring the panel together. In terms of movements to reform consumer finance, I think discussing credit scoring will add some really interesting texture, because there are, as you phrase it, debtor demands about credit scoring now, and the demands show a lot about the nature of consumer credit and how people are trapped by it in the current framework of thinking about what is money and where does credit fit in. So Chrystin, I've read your book in various versions before, and I was super excited to read the latest version and to focus in on chapter 8, which I think pairs really well with what Vijay brings out about harmful credit. So just a few comments, right? In the chapter, you refer to what we learned in a prior part about high-cost predatory debt never benefiting the debtor, and then you link that with your category of extractive debt. Right? And I think it'd be useful maybe for this chapter or renewed in this chapter or for the other part to detail as you might more of what like you defined as benefits, including the timeline. And you nod to this in the presentation because the debt will impoverish the borrower. That's how you're defining it. But they're going to say it benefits them in the short term. And that's really like, I think, the elegance of the book and bringing it out and then reminding your reader where you are. And then in terms of something I thought was maybe missing in the chapter that you could weave in, like one big category of debt is transportation debt. Because maybe like more reminder about auto loans, the intersection with transportation, because I view part of the shrinking social safety net, or just like the inability for this country to adapt to what's going on, is just like a conscious effort to require people to purchase cars, which creates a captive market for auto loans. And I really like that you mentioned subsidizing cars in passing, which I suggested in a more radical piece about auto loans. I got like a couple minutes. And so, Pat, I'm super excited to read your entire book. And you propose like 3 big changes in the chapter that you circulated, along with the nod at the end to the inadequacy of unemployment insurance. And I think you've done a really wonderful, rich, descriptive job of what's gone wrong with the things that you bring out, the inadequate minimum wage, earned income tax credit, child tax credit, and the unemployment insurance. And the connection between all of them and what makes it really interesting is that these are 4 things in which we as a country have pulled away from any semblance of trying to help households at all, right? And I really appreciated the discrete solutions in that it's each of these, and that within the solutions is something that is practical and I think potentially achievable. Right? People can rally around raising the minimum wage, and they have in certain areas. The idea of tax credits has wide appeal, and there's a rich literature about why it's so appealing. And I think helping people save money plays into people's views that it's just other people's fault that they can't save money. And so they'll get on board with being like, yeah, we'll force you to do it. That's not true. People can't save money because we don't pay them money, right? And everyone's going to benefit from realigning unemployment insurance. So I think my critique of the chapter is that it could benefit more from like flat out stating that and weaving that through. And you do the opposite really well with critiquing the problems with universal basic income. And so maybe more juxtaposition about what we really need to do to move the country forward now. And then Nakita, my favorite, because I just wrote about credit scoring, right? Right, credit scores, they're pervasive. This is my little ramp up, right? Having a credit score can be problematic. Not having one can be problematic. Adding data to credit scores is problematic. Alternative to credit scores is problematic. All of which is problematic, and I think points to, again, the fact that credit products are standing in for stuff that should be provided more and more so. And I like your idea of upending the credit score model with a presumption of credit worthiness. And I really like the ramp up to the solution, right, in the paper and also your presentation. Right? So when I was gonna note, like when I first read the abstract, I thought that the solution was that everyone starts with a perfect credit score. You turn 18, or you can pick when you turn 18, right? 16. Your credit score is 800 or the relevant equivalent. But then it sort of seemed like the idea was this is for credit impaired people maybe, which I don't know if you actually meant that, but it made me start thinking about how you determine who is credit impaired. And then also, can people have their slate wiped clean at different points during their lives? And I wrote down financial domestic abuse as a moment where someone can come out of a relationship and then get the slate wiped clean again. Because one of I think actually one of the leading reasons, if not the leading reasons, that women say they stay in an abusive relationship is the financial abuse and the fact that there's no way for them to be financially out of the relationship. And then I'd be interested in you spinning out what you think would be the effects of the use of credit scores and provision of credit to people who start out with a clean slate, because I'm kind of worried that this would just lead them to be just thrown out completely for the subset of population that starts with the clean slate, which I think might be part of your open questions. So with that, 4 fantastic works. We have like 7 minutes, and so there's a queue, and there's Rory, and then the other gentleman in the back. So maybe we'll do Rory, a queue, the other gentleman in the back, and see where we are. And there's a microphone.
Just for the Zoom audience.
All right, so what a fantastic set of projects. And I just wanted to ask how much of what you're talking about could potentially be expanded more broadly, or is ultimately really about consumer finance. So because there are certainly a lot of parallels in other consumer contexts, right? As a few quick examples, the analogy by Vijay of tax to consumer finance, there are all kinds of projects that have shown that people pay more for cell phone plans because of manipulation and confusing pricing strategically employed by cell phone carriers. Same with Amazon burying the best deals in the search results, right? Chrystin's project's harder to kind of find such parallels, but even there you could imagine human dignity being a guiding principle for some of these other consumer market contexts. And we even each have a consumer score for things like when we go to the stores that's tied to our loyalty programs or our credit cards, right? And so I guess I was just interested in hearing your thoughts about the extent to which some of your projects might yield broader insights into consumer law and consumer markets.
Rapid fire answers.
I don't have a mic, but I can come up here. Okay. I want to take this one because I actually took income tax. I never took tax in law school, so I was terrified of tax. But I was like, everything I'm writing about, the most important thing is that we need to fix our freaking tax system. So I need to learn tax. And I learned in income tax that a lot of the things that I noticed in consumer bankruptcy and consumer finance also are true, of course, in the tax context. This like weird differentiation between business and consumer spending, right? Which doesn't reflect in totally privileges, like the people who already have wealth and resources. It's just bonkers. And so like I really think probably like a new taxonomy, not the same taxonomy, but like inspired by human dignity and its core tenets, is definitely called for in the tax context. I just need to take like at least 14 more tax classes before I can do it. But maybe the tax expert out there wants to do it first. So yeah. I still hear Steve. But
I'm staying here.
and oh yeah. Fun question. Thinking about the different ways in which credit scoring could apply. The one thing that comes to mind, I think, is when you were talking about, or when you mentioned point systems. Because I've read a paper from him that talked about the point system for credit cards and how ultimately those who pay fees are the ones who are subsidizing many of our usage of credit score or credit card points to, reduce the cost of our flights and etc. And so actually thinking about those other areas in which that create, I guess, another system of privilege would be interesting, and probably sort of a similar idea that one needs the access in order to sort of build first. And is there a way for us to all start up with 100,000 miles once we get a credit card? So, I mean, it's an interesting point. It's something to think about. But I actually wonder if the credit score could solve some of that. Like if one has a good credit score and therefore access to getting to the point, if the financial institutions respect the idea that that credit score is valid, but then they have access to sort of credit cards that might have point systems, then the credit score is still the gateway to build those other scoring models.
It's a great question. I kind of want to punt and avoid it because I'm trying to be deliberately reductive and pretend like these claims can't be generalized in order to hopefully say something new about what consumer financial regulation is doing. But yeah, I think it's absolutely true that you can sort of like try to generalize these ideas and think about utility regulation as a contest over like our access to basic resources, or and so I think you can extend this kind of thought into other domains, but then it stops being like a monetary contest.
Pat?
Oh, yeah, and forgive me, I was having connection problems and missed part of the question, but one thing that I've found really interesting in working on my project is that there are ways in which if you allow debt to finance one particular household goal, it destroys the ability to realize other goals as well. They're all interconnected. So that medical debt, if it becomes too high due to, let's say, high copays and deductibles, or because you're uninsured, makes it impossible to get through the month and just pay for subsistence costs, makes it difficult to send your child to college. And so I think we have to be mindful that there are all these negative interactive effects of one type of credit on a household's economic well-being across the entire spectrum.
So technically we're at time, but if we all want to stay here a little longer, I know there's air in the back and there's people in the queue, and I don't want to forget the people online. So maybe we do a queue and then Aaron and then discuss.
So there's two questions, and I'm asking them on behalf of Lucille Eckrick. The first is for Vijay. What is consumer financial law? Can you define the term you talked about and what it all refers to? Then what is it you want to regulate differently about it and how? The second question is for Chrystin. You distinguished extractive debt from other kinds of debt, i.e. survival and opportunity, implying that the latter are not extractive. But in our existing money system, where we use private interest-bearing credit as our money, isn't all debt extractive? Isn't that our systemic problem? If so, why not advocate for monetary reform such that all our money is public? That is, publicly created, with its first use going for the public good, and can circulate in perpetuity.
Okay, that's a great question. So I guess consumer financial law is just and I sometimes say consumer financial reform and I sometimes say consumer financial regulation, but it's just the set of laws that pertain to consumer credit that's used for personal, family, or household purposes. And what am I proposing that we do? How am I proposing that we regulate these markets differently? I'm not actually proposing any regulatory solution. I'm trying to offer a different way to think about what this regulation is doing, to try to think of it as a way to manage some of the to try to think of it as a way to manage some of the regressivity that's built into our institutional arrangements around money and banking, and use that to tell sort of an institutional story about like consumer financial regulations' place in our overall monetary scheme.
Can you give an example? If there's time.
Oh yeah, I mean, a simple example is to think about redistributing institutional authority over monetary governance across different institutional actors representing different constituents, and one of those actors would be a consumer regulator.
So extractive debt, certainly much of survival and opportunity debt is also extractive. So these categories, there's really two dimensions there. But in terms of all debt being extractive, I actually do think there are some types of debt that aren't extractive. Like, you know, I bought my motorcycle on credit. I paid it off very quickly. I was not harmed in any way. I didn't have the cash at the moment, but I did on my next paycheck, and like it didn't cause me any harm. And I think that I think it's fine if there's still a market for those things. But as I said, I think that like when it comes to whether any sort of debt should exist and how it should exist, it's not just that we have to abolish all survival debt and all extractive debt, or move towards the abolition at least. But also we need a reparative approach to these things if we're ever going to get anywhere near our equality goals.
So, Aaron in the back, great, yes. You have enough time to quickly.
I'll speak quickly and try to briefly. Chrystin, I really liked how you categorize your taxonomy of different types of debt. I think it's very useful because survival debt is best met, I think, by the concept Patricia talks about and you talk about as well, about changing income, right? Debt is not the solution. And extractive debt is about taking the opportunity people have because of that need. I think when you go more into finance, you'll find there's extraction not just in debt, but many other ways. For example, 70% of customers who go to check cashers, right, have bank accounts. Why are they at check cashers? Because they get money, their funds immediately. The rest of the banking system takes 2 to 7 days, and that's an extractive payment. So you use the term debt. I encourage you to think about the financial system beyond just the extraction of credit to other extractions of services. But I think that's really great. Nakita, I love your paper. I love, one of the things I love about it is you're pushing back on this idea that making FICO better is a solution. I've always thought Brad Pitt had it right in Fight Club, right? You remember what I'm not giving, like, no spoilers, it's been 20 years. Like, what they blow up at the end of the day are the 3 credit bureaus. Like, why is your past predictive of your future? It isn't, right? There's much research out there showing there's a bunch of other things, cash flow underwriting, other things that have nothing to do with the past. Like, let's never have a credit score. Why do we even have scores? The only other thing that looks like 800 is an SAT. The whole reason they use the 800 number is to try and make people think it's legitimate. It has no legitimacy whatsoever. So think about alternative decision. The question is, are you credit worthy or not? Are you likely to repay me, and at what rate risk? What are the factors that are used to that? There's no reason to make a fictitious 3-digit figure that isn't even on a, isn't normalized in any meaningful way. And the last thing I'd say, Patricia, I'm intrigued by your idea. I worked on unemployment insurance, extending it frequently in the 2001 recession on the Hill. I'd encourage you to think 2 different thoughts. One is to think about implementation of some of your ideas. I think there's a little bit of a moment based on COVID and the inability of the computer systems. I mean, the actual state's infrastructure is so pathetic that
Yeah.
there's an idea that the states have the capability to process 1 million claims, and COVID showed that didn't. And the second is the nature of work. As the nature of work has permanently shifted from the 30s, our definitions of eligibility haven't, and maybe kind of push you a little bit to ask the question, if a gig worker, if somebody who's in a different type of economic structure, but then can't work for whatever reason for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, how would you think of that person being eligible rather than just the payroll employee view?
Yeah, thank you. And you're absolutely right about the state infrastructure. It was really appalling.
So we thank you for staying a bit over time. I think that we'll wrap up the panel. And my understanding is that there's food now, right?
Yes.
So everyone go get food, and thank you all for great presentations.
I didn't write down your name now, so I can follow your work. And I know you're